Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 29th episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, what's your favorite candy?
Favorite candy?
Yeah.
There's a lot of good candies.
If you had to go get some candy right now, what kind of candy would you go get?
Let's see. If I was getting a candy bar, it's probably a Snickers or a Three Musketeers. If I'm getting like bite candy, I think M&Ms and Skittles are both very good. I'm pretty high on chocolate, so I'd probably go with regular M&Ms, but Skittles are also very good.
Okay. These are all pleb tier answers so far. I'm not impressed.
What candy would you get then?
Peanut butter M&Ms. That's clearly the right answer.
No.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You get little bite-sized morsels of chocolate peanut butter, or you could just stuff a whole bag in your mouth at the same time, and either answer is fine.
No. Regular M&Ms are just better.
That's crazy talk. Regular M&Ms are only good in cookies. They're basically chocolate chips at that point. You might as well say, like, I like eating chocolate chips as my favorite candy.
M&Ms actually, I think, suck in cookies because they're like, they got the hard shells and like you can just put chocolate chips in and it's just better.
No, because that way you get the extra little crunch when you bite into them.
You don't want the extra little crunch. It's a cookie.
Yeah, you do, because you got to make a nice soft cookie. It can't be too crunchy. I guess if you're making like dry, crappy, crunchy cookies, then you throw crappy M&M or your crappy M&Ms in there, and then you get crunch on crunch. But yeah, do you know what the secret to making a good cookie is? By the way, I've learned this. I've learned this recently, and it's stepped up my cookie game tremendously. Replace like anywhere from a quarter to half of the amount of regular sugar with brown sugar, and it makes for a much more delicious, softer, better textured cookie.
Makes sense. Pretty sure the recipe that I stole from my old roommate has both regular sugar and brown sugar in it.
Oh, well, I have to see what kind of ratios they are then at that point.
Mm-hmm. All right. So what are we talking about today?
Your Iyslander list that you won Worlds with. We're finally getting around to that one. And you're going to tell everybody how to play this deck, because I'm looking at the win rates right now on Talishar since it's been posted. It's sitting at 46% win rate. And the deck's not that bad. I don't know if you've known this, but it's a pretty good deck, and it's won some tournaments so far. And I think the world, the people just need a deck tech, and they need your help, Michael. So please help people get better at playing Iyslander.
All right. Happy to help. So yes, let's get started.
Sounds great to me. Where do you want to start?
Should I read the deck list like we do for deck list reviews?
I'll read it.
I'll read
it. It's your masterpiece, so the least I can do is read it for you.
Okay.
So for Reds, Michael has 3 Aether Ice Vein, 3 Enlightened Strike, 3 Finals Fighting Spirit, 3 Scar for a Scar, 3 Sink Below, and 3 Wounded Bull. At Yellow, he has 2 Yellow Aether Ice Vein. At Blues, he now has 3 Aether Hail, 3 Aether Ice Vein, 3 Amulet of Ice, 3 Blizzard, 3 Brain Freeze, 3 Brothers in Arms, 3 Channel Lake Frigid, 3 Cold Snap, 3 Emeritus Scalding, 2 Energy Potion, 3 Frost Hex, 3 Frosting, 1 Heart of Findall, 2 Hypothermia, 3 Ice Bolt, 3 Ice Eternal, 3 Insidious Chill, and 3 Polar Blast. And then the equipment's at the bottom here. It's 1 Wading Moon, 1 Alluvian Constellus, 1 Coronet Peak, 1 Crown of Providence, 1 Findall Spring Tunic, 1 Iron High Gauntlet, 1 Iron Rot Gauntlet, 1 Metacarpus Node, 1 Nalrune Hood, and 1 Storm Strider. Does that sound all right to you?
Sounds right to me. I was following along on my other monitor. It all checks out.
Cool. I'm glad I can read. Okay, so what's the first matchup you want to talk about?
So I guess just before we jump into matchups, I'm going to talk briefly about the deck. So in general, the goal is that you are playing these efficient attacks, and if your opponent doesn't block them out, then you're going to deal a bunch of damage and ideally disrupt their turn with something from Arsenal. But regardless of whether you do disrupt their turn or not from Arsenal, you're always threatening to disrupt their turn. So it can be very punishing for them to not block out the attack to keep a powerful 5-card hand if you end up just having like a Channel Lake Frigid or something pretty disruptive in Arsenal. So that's kind of like the threat of the deck. And then another thing is the attacks are all super efficient. So like, even if they are blocking, if they block a Wounded Bull with 2 cards, they're still leaking like 2 damage They just block a Finals Fighting Spirit with 2 cards. They're leaking 1 damage. You're gaining a life. So you can make pretty efficient trades where if other decks are blocking with 2 cards and playing 2 cards back, most of the time you are going to be ahead in those trades because your attacks are so efficient. And a lot of the more aggressive decks, their 4-card hands are going to outperform what you do with your like they're going to get more value per card if they get to play a 4 or 5-card hand uninterrupted than you would get per card when you're playing these big attacks. But your goal is to disrupt their 4 or 5-card hands enough that like if they're just taking the damage to present these big hands back, then they're going to lose because their 4 or 5-card hands aren't doing what they are hoping they'd do, basically.
Yeah, it's crazy how much just like a Frostbite, obviously, and then on the higher impact, it's going to be the Aether Ice Veins and Channel Lake Fridges that are just either forcefully stripping cards out of your opponent's hand or just costing them extra resources that they don't want to necessarily be paying for their actions.
So on top of this efficient damage, Iyslander is a deck that, since her weapon requires her to play a non-attack action, and since a lot of her damage is just prevented with Arcane Barrier, she would become somewhat vulnerable to being fatigued, since you can block out her attacks and block out a lot of her arcane damage. But then the way that she can kind of play around getting fatigued is a combination of Amulet of Ice, Insidious Chill, and Frost Hex, and Ice Eternal also, I guess. So the biggest thing is with Amulet of Ice and Insidious Chill, if you play an Aether Ice Vein on your turn, then you're going to strip a lot more of their hand than you normally would from a disruptive effect. And because of that, they will have maybe 1 card or often 0 cards if you stack up enough of these on your turn. And then they're completely vulnerable to any damage you're going to deal on their turn. So that can be something like just casting an Emeritus Scolding into Waning Moon is 7 damage that gets around them fatiguing you. But the biggest thing that she can do to play around fatigue is if you have multiple Frost Hexes in play, then you can cast an Ice Eternal for X equals 4 or even X equals 5 with a Tunic counter, or even more if you have Energy Potions, which you don't have in a lot of the matchups, but X equals 5 is kind of a lot of the time what you're going for is pitching 3 blues and using a Tunic counter. And it's going to give them 5 Frostbites and deal 5 damage. And then 5 more damage for each Frost Hex you have in play at the end of their turn. So that can pressure like 15 damage if you just have 2 Frost Hexes in play. And then you can also pitch that last blue you used to fuse to Waning Moon as well. So you can get 18 damage not out of nowhere because there's a lot of setup, but in a way that's very hard for them to interact with. So she basically has those tools to kind of fight against fatigue.
Yeah, and I guess touching on the fatigue thought process in general, it's incumbent on the Iyslander pilot then to realize and always keep track of what your density of threats are left in your deck. So it's pretty common that you'll halfway through the game realize, okay, I've played 2 Enlightened Strikes. I played all of my final Finding Spirits are blocked with them, and I only have 1 Wounded Bull left in my deck, and I had a block with a red Aether Ice Vein on a critical turn, so I only have like 6-ish threats left in my deck, and my opponent's still at 30. Like the alarm bell should be starting going off in your head, and you need to start really thinking about hard pivoting towards the more disruptive elements of the combo instead of just relying on those efficient attacks. It's just something that is very important to always be thinking about over the course of the game.
Yeah, and that's one easy way to lose games if you aren't thinking about it is you run out of attacks, your opponent's at 22 life, and you have no Frost Hexes in play. A lot of the hands you're going to draw at that point aren't going to be very threatening because you don't have any of your big attacks, which is basically the only way you can like threaten damage on your turn. Those and Aether Ice Veins.
Yeah, it's hard to close games with blue frostings, that's for sure.
Yeah. So if you end up in that spot, it's going to be tough if you didn't play out any Frost Hexes and you run out of attacks and they have a pretty high life total.
Okay.
So I guess ready to move into matchups now.
Okay, where do you want to start?
All right, let's start with Fi, because I think Fi is probably one of the best decks, has been one of the best decks for a while, and I expect it to always be, maybe not always, but for the foreseeable future, it'll be a significant threat to the metagame.
Okay, from like a macro level, do you think you're favored in the match, or do you think it's 50-50 or they're favored?
I think it's really close, and it kind of depends on a few things. If I honestly don't really know whether we're favored or not. I think the matchup's tough, and a lot of the reason it's tough is because Fi is pretty good at hiding how many resources he'll need during the turn. So you don't always know when your frostbites will be efficient attacks him. You don't always know when they're going to be able to arcane barrier your waning moon activations without it costing them a lot. So because of that, it can be pretty tricky to time your disruption. There are a couple things that you have going for you in the matchup. First is that Channel Lake Frigid is huge against Fi, and a lot of the time he wants to play 3 to 6 cards or effects each turn, and that just means having a channel in play that turn means he needs 3 to 6 more resources to do that same turn, which is not really possible. Like a lot of the time he can pay 3 extra resources for channel, but he won't have nearly as big of a turn as he would have if he didn't have a channel.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the biggest thing that you want to focus on against Fi is getting your channels out. And then the other thing is, I guess I'm going to jump and compare Fi to Briar a little bit. Briar's biggest turns are obvious when they're going to happen. She has a Channel Mount Heroic going into her turn. It's obvious it's going to be a big turn, or at least has the threat of being a big turn. Whereas Fi, you don't really know when that's coming. Just he has a 5-card hand. He randomly goes Belittle, Reveal Thing, cast an Art of War, and suddenly
you're off to the races.
Yeah. Suddenly it's a huge turn, and you're just like, whoa. So it can be pretty difficult to make sure you have answers for that kind of stuff. And the good news is Fi doesn't play 2 and 3 card hands very effectively. So just like disrupting him enough of the time, a lot of the time you can just like build an advantage over the game. And then his big turn is going to be a big turn if you don't have a channel like Frigid or Blizzard at the right time. And there's not really anything you can do about that. But hopefully throughout the rest of the game, you have built enough of an advantage that it makes up for basically how much damage you leak during the big turns.
Yeah, and it's just a race. It's just a straight up race with the Fi, because they obviously are not very incentivized to block because they have a lot of 2 blocks in their deck. So they're not very often going to just spend all 4 of them blocking out Wounded Bulls for 8. And they don't really want to be pitching a lot of extra resources into Arcane Barriers. So it's interesting that a lot of the Fi players now don't even bother with Arcane Barrier 2. They just stick with the Arcane Barrier 1, Findall's Spring Tunic, Tracker Stripe Shuko, and I think Mask of the Pouncing Lynx is usually favored for them. And they just try to go as fast as possible to get you before you can really get into like any of those setups that Iyslander really wants to get to in order to prolong the game.
Yeah. So talking about sideboarding for the matchup, since it's just a race, you're not really worried about getting fatigued, and most Fis don't even have the AB3 to even threaten the fatigue. So against Fi, currently I am just cutting my combo pieces. I'm cutting Frost Hexes, I'm cutting Ice Eternal, and I'm cutting Energy Potion, of course. Since it's a race, you don't want cards that are, or you want all your cards that are as efficient as possible. So I'm playing all of the reds in this matchup. Just
okay. What about Amulet of Ice? Why don't you talk to me a little bit about that card? Because that doesn't block either.
Yeah, so Amulet of Ice is very good because you can use it to basically just trade for a full card. And Amulet of Ice is just like one of the best cards in Iyslander outside of the fact that it doesn't block, because Iyslander can really struggle to use 4-card hands. And having Amulet of Ice as just a thing with Go Again that you're very happy to get in play is a perfect way to use those 4-card hands. You play Amulet of Ice and then attack with the thing in Arsenal, your last card. It also, since Fi's power scales multiplicatively with how many cards he has in his hand, if you have an Amulet of Ice on a turn, maybe you Aether Ice Vein him and he just takes 5 and discards a card, or pitches a blue for AB1 and pays the 2. Having an Amulet to just like strip 1 more card to make him play a smaller hand can be very powerful. On top of that, this is a matchup where Brain Freeze is very good. You can Brain Freeze them and then look at their hand and you kind of know what their hand's capable of and if you should amulet that hand or not. So
getting that information is critical.
Yeah, for those reasons, I've been pretty happy with Amulet Device in the matchup. It can suck if you're going second and the Fi attacks all out and you draw Amulet Device plus another no block or 2 Amulet Device or something. Even just drawing one sometimes results in you taking like a reasonable amount of extra damage. That
like 3 to 4.
Yeah, like 3 extra damage than you would if it was just a random 3 block like a Frost Hex or an Ice Eternal instead. But I think
that math checks out.
The upside of it is high enough that I think it is correct to leave it in. And I could see that changing if you're like losing games because that 1 or 2 or 3 damage you leak extra going second. And for a while I was sideboarding this out going second, but I think the deck just kind of needs it to smooth things out. And then lastly, it's also very nice to be able to Arsenal this card, play it from Arsenal and give them a Frostbite without committing any resources. So you don't have to Waning Moon them if they're going to end their turn with like 2 resources floating because they had to pitch an extra card to pay for the amulet or something.
Yeah.
Or pay for the Frostbite. So it has a lot of upside. And I think it's one of the best cards in Iyslander. And right now I'm not cutting it in any matchups.
Okay, that's interesting.
Though I think there is another matchup where I'd like to discuss it because I think it might be correct to cut it against Dromai, but we'll get to that when we get there.
Sounds good. Okay. Any final thoughts about Fi? I guess we didn't talk about the defense reactions at all. How important are cards like Sink Below and Brothers in Arms?
So the biggest thing is stopping their 4 power attacks and just getting efficient value out of your cards. Brother in Arms is really important in a lot of spots because Iyslander has this problem where she gets a tunic counter and she doesn't always have a great way to use it. You can arsenal your 2-cost things like Channel Lake Frigid or Ice Bolt. But Ice Bolt's not a card you're like looking to arsenal that often, and you only have 3 Channel Lake Frigids in your deck. So, and also sometimes when you play Channel Lake Frigid, you're not wanting to Waning Moon them the same turn anyway because they're going to waste resources because they can't use their hand efficiently or whatever because there's a Channel Lake Frigid in play.
Yeah, Emeritus Scalding is the other 2-1 that matters a lot, but yeah.
That's true. I generally am only looking to arsenal that when it's lethal, but it is relevant. And I guess that is another way you can spend your tunic counter if you don't really have a way to spend your tunic counter. So, but the biggest thing is that they stop the Mounting Anger breakpoint and also Snatch, but it's kind of harder to line these up with Snatch. But they stop Mounting Anger breakpoint, which is very nice since it's just 1 extra damage if the Fi gets the Mounting Anger off. So they're basically blocking 5 against Mounting Anger, which is great.
Okay. Awesome.
Lastly, for equipment, Coronet Peak's great. As long as they don't have tunic counter, it's great to trade a card for a card. A lot of the time, a common line will be you play Scar for a Scar and then activate Coronet Peak and arsenal a card. And that happens a reasonable amount in the matchup. I think Tunic's the only chest that makes sense. It doesn't have arcane damage, so you don't want to lose in. For the gloves, this is the thing that I'll kind of talk about. That's really weird that there is Iron Rot and Ironhide Gauntlet in the deck because usually you just play whichever one's better. This Iron Rot Gauntlet was kind of a last minute choice for Worlds because of Fi specifically. And the reason for that is Fi is a hero that frequently ends their turn with an action point left over and just arsenals their last card. You don't really know what that card is while Fi is playing his turn. Maybe he goes like attack with a 0 for 3 and then swing the Searing Ember Blade with 1 floating, pays 1 to get back a Phoenix Flame, attacks the Phoenix Flame, and they have 1 card left over in their hand. And you can't, a lot of times to use your hand efficiently, you need to block earlier on because you don't really, like if the turn just ends there and you have another card you wanted to block with, then it's really unfortunate, I guess. So basically the reason I have the Iron Rot Gauntlet is so that you can, if they end their turn with a Snatch, because almost every Fi deck is playing 3 Snatches. If they end their turn with a red Snatch, then you can block with an extra 3 block and the Iron Rot Gauntlet and stop the Snatch on hit. And the reason that it's really weird is because if you don't have the Iron Rot Gauntlet, if you have Ironhide Gauntlet or something else, you need a tunic counter to be able to block out the Snatch in that same spot, or you're going to have to be putting 2 cards into blocking the Snatch, which is really bad and usually means you just won't have a turn if you do that. Whereas like if they Snatch, you block with a 3 block and Iron Rot Gauntlet, maybe your hand's like 2 blues and a Wounded Bull, which is a pretty common hand you would keep and not block anymore with because you're going to play the Wounded Bull and arsenal the last blue. Then the Snatch you can block with one of the blues, and the Iron Rot Gauntlet you can still play the Wounded Bull, you just lose out on an arsenal, which isn't that big of a deal if they are snatching there, because then they're going to have a 4-card hand because they didn't have an arsenal, because that's why they played the snatch. So,
Okay.
Yeah, that's why Iron Rot Gauntlet's in the deck. I think that's the only matchup I'm playing it in right now. I'm pretty sure that's true.
Okay.
Okay. What was your question that I stopped to talk about equipment?
I was just going to point out that it's interesting that you talk about Brother in Arms being able to utilize the Tunic resource to block for 4, but then it's an issue that I guess you don't want Brothers in Arms and Gauntlet then both being the sinks for that Tunic resource. Then you just are looking to just only use the Brother in Arms for it then.
Yeah, I think it's more not that Ironhide Gauntlet is bad in the matchup. I think Ironhide Gauntlet was perfectly serviceable. I think it's just that Iron Rot Gauntlet is actively good because of that snatch situation.
Okay.
So if I don't have Iron Rot Gauntlet in the deck, I'm perfectly happy to play Ironhide Gauntlet and it's fine. But that snatch situation does come up very regularly, and the Iron Rot Gauntlet has helped a lot in my testing.
I believe it.
Okay.
Okay, moving on. Are you still have more to say?
I think I only listed 8 cards to cut. The Frost Hexes, the Ice Eternals, and the Energy Potions.
Mm-hmm.
So the last 2 cuts, I think, should be blues. I've kind of moved around on what they should be. I think I'm kind of low on Hypothermia in the matchup, but if all the Phis know you're not on Hypothermia, that kind of gives them some room to gain an edge. So I think when a lot of times in the tournament, I've been cutting Hypothermias into Phi or trimming down to just 1, so that like they kind of have to respect it, but you don't ever have to arsenal it and have it be sitting awkwardly in your arsenal waiting for them to play a Blaze Headlong or use Tide Flippers or something. But that's the last card I would cut currently, is the 2 Hypothermias. You could also cut the Heart of Final when you're going second, because it doesn't block, and I think the upside is a lot lower than the Amulet of Ice's upside of just like...
Yeah, you're not going to get second cycle to get 2 life out of it.
Yeah. But going first, I'd never cut a Heart, but going second, I think it's very reasonable to cut it. Okay. And now I'm ready to move on.
We did it. We got through 5. So what's the next hot deck you want to discuss in the meta right now? Is it Levia? Are we going to finally learn how to sideboard against Levia?
No, but I'll talk about Levia if you want to. You kind of have...
No. Okay. We'll save the best for last. We'll save
you don't if we have time, we'll get to it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess next would be Oldhim. Oldhim's pretty common, and I think that matchup is pretty tricky from the Iyslander side because...
Yeah, I think it's very, very skill dependent on who wins, as somebody who's lost Oldhim a lot. So
from the Iyslander side, I don't like Scar for Scar in the matchup because Stalagmite is very good against Scar for Scar. If you attack with Scar, they Stalagmite you. It feels so bad. I think if you know they're not going to be playing Stalagmite, if you know they're on Arcane Lantern or something, and you know, or they're going to be on Sledge, I'm usually pretty happy with Scar for Scar because it's an efficient red. But if they have Stalagmite, it's really bad. And then it can also be kind of tough against Ice React. But I think that's like, so the combination of Stalagmite plus Ice React makes it really awkward a lot of the time. If they don't have Stalagmite, I think it's still worth playing it over Ice React. But that said, in Swiss, I'm leaning towards cutting it if I don't know their deck.
Yeah, I think we've seen that evolution where first Oldhim was just all in on sledging in the matchup. And I think over time against Iyslander, they realized that Stalagmite plus Winter's Wail is actually the way to go. Iyslander, oddly, is a deck that really doesn't play well through these disruptive effects like a single Frostbite or Channel like Frigid. So when you look at it from that perspective, like Wounded Bull is great when it's just 2 cards for 8 damage, but having to pitch that extra card and turning into 3 cards for 8 damage makes the deck atrocious on rate. So that's why I think Winter's Wail started to pick up a little bit more in popularity.
Yeah, and that's part of the cost of like trying to make your deck as efficient as possible is you're making all these deck building decisions to maximize use of your resources, and then suddenly if your opponent's like, you need 1 more resource, well, your deck isn't built in a way to really pay that cost because it's using all of its resources. So I think Winter's Wail plus Stalagmite's probably the best configuration from the Oldhim side if you know you're playing against an Iyslander.
For sure.
Or against an Iyslander with attack actions.
Yeah, but that's going to be the vast majority of Icelanders now. I mean, who would play stupid old arcane damage when you could play Wounded Bull?
The other cards I'm cutting Blizzards and Hypothermias. There was a time where I think it might be correct to leave Hypothermias in against Oldhim, where they had Enlightened Strike, Zealous Belting, and Rouse the Ancients. I don't think you can expect most Oldhims to have all three of those cards. And even if they do, you won't know it in Swiss. So in a top 8 situation where you see their deck list and they have all three of those, it is probably reasonable to leave Hypothermia in. Blizzard's just bad.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, it doesn't block and it's too situational.
And then for the last cards you cut, you definitely want all your combo pieces in this matchup. And you want most of your cards. And then the last thing I would cut is either not Brother in Arms, Brain Freeze or Polar Blast. I'm still not sure what rate I want on each of those. Polar Blast is very good once you start getting multiple Frost Hexes in play because it threatens a lot of damage when you have Frost Hexes, and a lot of the time you are planning to Frost Hex Oldhim. And then Brain Freeze kind of sucks, but it blocks for 3, and you need a reasonable amount of 3 blocks against Oldhim. So, especially since a lot of your normal blue 3 blocks, like Ice Eternal and Frost Hex, that in a lot of matchups you don't mind blocking with them, you need them to combo Oldhim.
Okay. It's interesting that you're saying that the plan is to mostly combo or Frost Hex Oldhim, though, because I think that's why I've struggled in this matchup a little bit, is I wasn't necessarily expecting Oldhim to slant as aggressive as he has been, I guess, over the past few months. And I was really punished for expecting this slower, long, grindy game where we'll both obviously get to second cycle. You know, it's not like we're going to be hitting each other for 14 damage a turn, and then all of a sudden Oldhim's hitting me for 14 damage a turn. So do you think that the combo is just something that wax and wanes depending on how Oldhim's built in the meta, or is it just something you're always looking to do?
No, plan A is still just play the tempo game and race them. A lot of the Oldhims that I've played against, as they've gotten more used to playing against Iyslander, so basically post nationals and like testing leading up to Worlds, the Oldhims were getting their reps in against the deck, learning if they blocked out these attack actions, then Iyslander would have the problem that we were kind of talking about at the beginning of the video, where suddenly she just draw 4 blues every hand because she used all of her attacks in second cycle and can't really do anything on her turn. So the Oldhims could play really defensively and make sure they're blocking out these big attacks. And then Iyslander would kind of run out of fuel and Oldhim would end the game at 20 something or still be at 20 something life. And at that point, it's probably too late to start establishing your Frost Hexes because you're just going to eat a bunch of damage while you're trying to set those up at that point. So instead, where I've kind of ended up is I'm playing these attacks pretty early. And if they are blocking the attacks with 2 or even 3 cards, sometimes they'll do that, then I will try to find windows where I can play a Frost Hex or an Insidious Chill or other combo pieces and just leave them with a 5-card hand. Because a lot of the time, if you leave Oldhim with a 5-card hand, there's a reasonable chance he won't be able to use his hand efficiently, and he'll just like waste a full card or waste 2 resources out of it or something.
Okay.
And that kind of, the odds of them being able to use a 5-card hand increases the more copies of Pummel they play. But also, the more copies of Pummel they play, the worse they are at blocking. So if they aren't blocking, if they are blocking a lot, they probably can't have that many Pummels because Pummel requires basically a 4-card hand or a 3-card hand in the case of CNC Pummel with a Tunic counter. But almost always it requires a 4-card hand to really use, and it blocks for 2. So if you have a lot of Pummels in your deck as Oldhim, you're kind of forced to block less. And when they're forced to block less, you don't have to combo them. You just have to combo them. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
You only have to combo them if they're blocking out your reds pretty well or pretty effectively.
And the CNC Pummel is the whole reason why you're playing Crown of Providence in this matchup instead of Coronet Peak. Because in theory, Coronet Peak should be pretty good in this matchup. Oldhim needs a lot of resources, and they aren't always trying to like pitch cards on your turn to use Crown of Seeds or things like that as they would in other matchups. So Coronet Peak would normally be fairly impactful in the matchup, I would think, but given just the threat of those Command and Conquer Pummels, you switch to Crown of Providence, right?
Yeah, I actually don't love Coronet Peak in the matchup because a lot of the time as Oldheim adds more cards to his hand, he gets less efficient. Whereas, like, if you compare it to the aggro decks, where like as they get more cards, every card gets more efficient. Oldheim, with one card, he can swing Winter's Well for 4 to Frostbite. With 2 cards, he can swing Winter's Well and Arsenal a card, I guess. Or he can play like a 3 for 7, but usually those don't have great on hits. And
yeah, but it's kind of like what you were talking about before, where if they're not blocking, then they're probably keeping their whole hands and looking to actually try to play, those pummels and like those Rouse the Ancients or Zal's Beltings and things like that. And I guess in those situations, I would expect Coronet Peak to be more impactful than I guess if they were trying to just like go for the fatigue route. So I guess it is contextual.
Yeah, if the Oldheim's on a very aggressive version of the deck, then I could see Coronet Peaking being.
But then if they're on the aggressive version, then they're CNC pummeling you. So it's like,
yeah. So Crown of Providence is really good. It lets you arsenal red cards sometimes because you have that out to CNC pummel. And even sometimes when you have a blue card in arsenal, you don't always really want to play it because maybe they're going to 4-card CNC pummel you. So they're going to have 2 resources floating. So like dealing extra damage to them with playing a blue from arsenal and waning mooning them is not really efficient when they have that. So you'd rather just Crown of Providence it away.
Okay. And then is this the matchup where you're playing Ironhide Gauntlet then? I imagine you're not playing Iron Rod in this matchup though.
Yeah, so this is Ironhide Gauntlet, Tunic, Crown of Providence, and every matchup Storm Strider, so I'm not going to talk about that.
Yeah, you never not Storm Striders. It's crazy. Oh, I was going to ask one more question. Have you thought of playing more defense reactions for this matchup? Like if it really got to be a point that they just got really aggressive with pummels and things like that, like could you see moving towards like unmovables or anything like that or no?
Yeah, I think I would lean towards Fate Foreseen before I went to Unmovable because I think Fate Foreseen is pretty good against Fi and it has other spots where it's nice. But
yeah, I agree.
The biggest reason I I ended up on just the sync belows is when I was testing for Nationals, some of the Oldheims were on Heart of Ice. And if you have multiple defense reactions and they Heart of Ice you, it's like really bad.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So I think that it's definitely reasonable, especially since most Oldheims aren't playing Heart of Ice or playing it in their deck or in this matchup. It's just not a card that most bring.
Yeah, I would imagine Bolander's pretty happy to sit across from an Oldheim who's presenting a Heart of Ice just because that's not really what the game's about.
Yeah, and yeah, I would agree.
Okay, we can move on now.
Okay. So next would be the Mirror, I guess.
We're saving the Rune Blades for last? Sure. Yeah, let's talk about the Mirror.
Yeah, I think these are I guess I've talked about the decks in kind of the order that I expect. Maybe Iyslander should be higher, but I think
shots fired.
I think the Rune Blades are in a rough spot because of in my opinion, they're a horrible matchup into Iyslander. But anyway, so Iyslander, the Mirror, Sink Below, and Scar for a Scar are both quite bad in the matchup. Scar for Scar is bad for a couple of reasons. One, you aren't going to be lower than them nearly as often as you're lower than other heroes because they have the same stuff as you. They have the Storm Striders. They have the lower starting life.
Lower starting life. Yeah.
So Scar, and even if you are, sometimes you play Scar for a Scar and then they give you a Frostbite and you look at your blue and your Wounded Bull or your blue and your Final Fighting Spirit and you can't play it because of the Frostbite. So Scar for a Scar comes out. Sink Below is okay in some spots if they're on Bolander and not on traditional Iyslander. And because of those reasons, it's basically isn't worth how much it costs to include it in your deck as opposed to just like another 3-block. You just put a blue 3-block in your deck and the blue is going to be better against arcane damage, better anytime they don't attack you.
Whereas, yeah, it's a card you definitely never want to Arsenal, right?
I don't think it's the end of the world if you Arsenal it most of the time, but if your opponent knows about it, then it's rough.
I could believe that one.
So, and then after you cut the Scars and the Sinks, you just cut 5 blues. I think Yellow Aether Ice Vein isn't great in the matchup, but you just need to have ways to trigger your Insidious Chills and your Amulet of Ice. Red Aether Ice Vein is a lot more than 1 point better because if you have 1 Insidious Chill, then it takes 7 resources to cover up the red Ice Vein plus the Insidious Chill trigger. Whereas yellow just takes 6, so it's clean off 2 cards. So red Insidious Chill is reasonably better than, or red Aether Ice Vein is reasonably better than yellow, but I think it's still good enough that you keep the yellow. And then for the blues, the worst blue is Blizzard. It doesn't block. It is ice, which is nice, but it doesn't block and it doesn't turn on Winning Moon. And you can't really get it out of your deck because unless you're just like casting it on something that doesn't have Go again anyway. So I cut the 3 Blizzards. And then I think the last cut is kind of between Hypothermia and Brain Freeze. And it's basically whether you'd rather have the ice card or the 3 block. I think currently I'm leaning towards the 3 block, but
I would agree.
Yeah, so I could see cutting. If you think that having another ice card matters more, I think it's fine to cut the Brain Freeze instead of the Hypothermia.
Yeah, I think blocking is obviously going to be important in the matchup, given that you really don't want to be presenting arcane damage if you can at all help it most of the time, because you're both going to be playing Alluvian and Gunstellus. So anytime that you're giving them the charges on Alluvian, it's not getting the full value off of it, because it's almost not only preventing that 1 damage when they pitch to prevent it, but it's almost like dealing 1 back to you then at that point. So it's just not the best thing to be doing, obviously, all the time in the matchup. And that's why in Nationals in particular, when the Icelanders weren't on Bullander, you just had a field day with them because you just had a substantial advantage of ways to deal damage of them that didn't require you to charge their Alluvian Constellus, but they didn't.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that in one way, like this is a matchup that you usually want to Frost Hex them in, because a lot of the time you just like can't get enough damage through without Frost Hexing because they have so many blues to pay for arcane damage and so many 3 blocks to just stop the physical attacks. But sometimes if you get an early Frost Hex out, it can be really weird to find spots to cycle your arsenal, because you'll give them that 1 Frostbite if you play like a Cold Snap or a Polar Blast or something from Arsenal. And that 1 Frostbite represents 1 arcane damage that they can block with an extra card and charge their Alluvian. So in general, I'm definitely looking to set up my Frost Hexes and my Insidious Chills pretty early in this matchup and often, and not pitch them too often. But there is some tension there with the first Frost Hex. Yeah.
And then let's talk about Channel Lake Frigid in this matchup, because in my opinion, I think it's the most important card for when it's played, especially at the end of the game. If you can either get it to be an end game pitch stack or it's at the end of your first cycle, just lucky enough. And what it does is it basically gives you a security blanket from them just trying to kill you out of nowhere, because it's a lot harder for them to try to pop Storm Striders, use their Alluvian Constellus, use their Waning Moon, play these cards either from hand or arsenal through a Channel Lake Frigid. And that's why I think it's just like matters so much in the end game.
Yeah. If you can set it up where you have your Channel Lake Frigid pretty close to pretty early in the second cycle or the end of the first cycle, it's really powerful. Not only does it make it like really hard to kill you, since Storm Striders cost an extra resource, whatever they're trying to play off, Storm Striders cost an extra resource. It also means that anytime they want to pop an Amulet Device or an Energy Potion, it costs a resource, and activating Alluvian also costs a resource. So it just gets really hard for them to kill you, I guess, when you have a channel in play. And then even the cards that aren't trying to kill you, costing 1 extra resource is really annoying. So playing your Frost Hex, playing your Insidious Chill all cost 4 resources instead of 3, like we were talking about earlier with just how Iyslander is vulnerable to a Frostbite. She's also very vulnerable to Channel Lake Frigid and doesn't want to see it in play. It can be kind of difficult to find a good window to play it out, because a lot of the time, if you arsenal it and you play it, then they're just going to do whatever they were going to do in response. Like if they play a non-attack action, you play your channel, they're just going to Winning Moon you then if they wanted to Winning Moon you, and if not, then they don't care. But it is very valuable to get it down later in the game.
Yeah, and one of the critical cards you mentioned in that evaluation is what I think is the second most impactful card in the matchup, which is weird because it's marginal to garbage most of the other time, but it's Energy Potion. And Energy Potion just being that enabler for the endgame combo, obviously, first and foremost, that's why it's there, is to help you charge up and make your Insidious Chills bigger than they would be otherwise.
Ice Eternals.
Ice Eternals bigger than they would be otherwise. But I guess I was thinking about it because it allows you to pay for Insidious Chills or these Amulet Devices. Less so Amulet Device, because let's say your opponent fuses an ice card, and they have an Insidious Chill and an Amulet of Ice out, and you go to crack an energy pot in order to pay for the Insidious Chill, they can, in response, activate their Amulet of Ice as an instant. So their Amulet of Ice will resolve before your energy from the energy potion has resolved. So it's just a really important timing thing to keep in mind in the matchup. But overall, it's just really impactful for just giving you flexibility in spots where you wouldn't have it otherwise.
Yeah. And one last thing to add about the energy potion is that situation I was talking about where you sometimes don't want to play your arsenal because they have you have given them a frost X already. Energy potion doesn't give them frostbite, so you don't have to worry about it charging their Alluvian. Last, the Northern Hood's basically only for this matchup. You also played against Kano, but there's not very much Kano that exists. And I think if you don't expect very much Iyslander, it's reasonable to cut. I don't think you're at a huge disadvantage in the mirror if you don't have it. It's definitely better than the 2 blocking hats in the mirror, but if you don't expect very much Iyslander at all, it's fine to cut the Northern Hood.
Yeah, it's really only matters against Ready at their Ice Veins, right?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. And then I guess this is the first matchup we're playing Metacarpus Node, though. So why don't you talk about Metacarpus Node?
Yeah, so Metacarpus Node, it's mostly there for the extra Arcane Barrier. And the other gloves kind of suck. Iron Rod and Ironhide are not very good gloves in general. Metacarpus Nodes is much more powerful. You just need an excuse to play it, like the Arcane Barrier being relevant. Mm-hmm. And basically, the turn that you're killing, a lot of the time you can play a damage card from Arsenal, plus Stormsword is a damage card from your hand, and you can pitch 2 extra resources into Metacarpus Nodes to basically increase your damage by 2. It also matters with Ice Eternal, where you play Ice Eternal, you have 0 resources floating, you fuse a card, then you can put the Metacarpus Node trigger on the stack and pitch the blue that you fuse the Ice Eternal with to pump the damage of Ice Eternal by 1 with Metacarpus Node, and then use your last 2 to Winning Moon. So those are the 2 spots that you really activate it with, either 2 damage spells or with Ice Eternal. But you can find other windows, I guess, but it's more straightforward.
Yeah, pitching a blue with Emeritus Scalding to clean that up to 5 damage at instant speed is pretty nice.
Yeah. And you should basically never be popping Metacarpus Nodes unless you're killing them, or killing them maybe the turn after. But
yeah, same with Stormstriders though, right? I guess we haven't talked about that, where you really, it's almost always a losing play to pop Stormstriders before you're actually killing your opponent, just because you'll get into those endgame states where your opponent will be within like those otherwise lethal ranges, and you just can't play your cards at instant speed. You just don't have that threat anymore. So once you get to those lower life totals, you're just actually at the same like disadvantaged state than any other hero would be at the end of the game then at that point, which is not where Iyslander wants to be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are exceptions, but like there aren't very many. If your opponent Phi goes Art of War Spreading Flames, maybe you can Stormstriders them there, maybe not even 100%, but or your opponent on Briar has a Channel Mount Heroic and you basically know they have several go again attacks somehow, then you could pop it to strip their hand. But a lot of the time their average damage output is not going to be high enough to warrant using Stormstriders, even if you have like a Red Aether Ice Vein that you want to fire off to disrupt their turn.
Yeah, the handful of times that I was in situations that I thought it would be worth it, I wound up losing those games anyways down the line, because like I said, we just got to those endgame states where we're both at low life totals, and I just didn't have the reach that is what makes Iyslander so potent in those endgame states, and I just kind of died because I just couldn't present the damage that obviously I would be otherwise had I been able to play my cards at instant speed. So
yeah,
it's kind of awkward about them.
Yeah. So I think in general, if you're unsure, just don't use Stormstriders. Between Nationals and Worlds, I think I popped my Stormstriders on turns that were not the last turn of the game 0 times. So
I would believe it.
There are times where it is correct, but there are not very many of them.
Okay. Now is it Runeblade time? Is it Runeblade o'clock?
Yeah, Runeblade o'clock.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the more joke of the 2 Runeblades first?
That's right.
Yeah. And I say a joke because I always said it was a buy. And then in the last pro quest I think we played at, or it's a Battle Hardened, I lost to Viserai in like my last round of the Battle Hardened. And I was just like shocked. Shout out to Kevin Breyer. He's a very good player. But Yeah, I could not believe that I lost to a Viscerai. Like, I've always considered it to be a buy for Iyslander up until that point.
Yeah, so Viscerai is the only non-wizard matchup that you get to play Alluvian Constellus against because he threatens arcane damage almost every turn because of his Rune Chance. Even if he's not attacking with Rosetta Thorn, it's really hard for him to avoid attacking with Rune Chance or popping Rune Chance. Mm-hmm. So because of that, Alluvian Constellus just gets so much value over the course of the game. And it also means you can be less selective about what kind of blues you arsenal, because like a lot of the time I don't want to arsenal my Frostings because if I play Frosting and winning with them, it's only spending 2 resources. I don't want to arsenal my Ice Bolts because if I play Ice Bolt and winning with them, it costs 4 resources and I can't really use the other 2. Against Viscerai, a lot of that is...
None of that matters.
Yeah, none of that matters. You can arsenal whatever you want, however the hands line up to arsenal cards. You can just dump your extra resources into using Alluvian on Rune Chance, and it's great. The other thing is you're also very good at blocking because Brother-in-Arms can also very easily help you reach those blocking breakpoints for mob skies and stuff. And both, this is kind of a Viscerai and a Briar problem where you can leave your card in arsenal and wait to see if the Frostbite will stop them from swinging with Rosetta Thorn. It's kind of face up if it will or won't most of the time because they have to play their non-attack and their attack with go again. And then they're going to either have no resources floating or 1 resource floating or more than 1 resource floating. And when they have 1 resource floating, give them a Frostbite.
Makes sense.
So the
Viscerai... And then... Oh, go ahead.
So Viscerai matchup, pretty tough for Viscerai. I am not honestly sure how I want to sideboard in the matchup. Most of your cards are pretty good, and the blues are all pretty good at blocking. So I don't
Energy Potion's the big one. Easy cut, doesn't block. It's not really what the matchup's about. You don't need the extra energy because Waning Moon's free the whole match. I could also see cutting some of the attacks, whether it could be Wounded Bull because you are often ahead in the matchup pretty frequently just because they're just taking 3 damage from Waning Moon every turn, it feels like. Or I guess every other turn, given the nature of Viscerai. You just don't... You're just so efficient at presenting damage through other means that you just don't need Wounded Bull as much. And maybe some of like the cards that I guess don't really impact them super much, like if you wanted to Brain Freeze, they kind of are playing a lot of big bulkier attacks. There's not a lot of zeros you can take from them. The zeros you can take are impactful, definitely, but it's not going to come up all the time, and that kind of puts Brain Freeze in an awkward spot. But I would say like the all-star of the match, though, is Hypothermia, just because like every turn they obviously want to be playing Mauvern Skies into their attack, and when you just play Hypothermia and they're like, oh, my attack doesn't have go again anymore. Or you play a Hypothermia when they are confidently attacking you with like a Swarming Loomveil or something like that. And it's just like, oh, well, I guess I just attacked you for 4 this turn. Your turn.
Yeah.
And it's like, thanks. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. I agree with those. I could also see a world where you cut Sink Below. I'm not sure what a Viscerai plan that consistently beats Iyslander looks like, but it wouldn't surprise me if the way that Viscerai does end up beating Iyslander involves not attacking on a reasonable amount of turns. And in that case, if the Viscerais aren't attacking every turn, then Sink Below starts looking a lot worse.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the Discord chat that was popping up over the past week? Shout out to the Patreon, or I guess it's not even Patreon, but just the Manor Discord chat where people were asking if Fatigue Viscerai is possible now because of the new card. It's like Diabolic Edict or something like that, where it forces each player to sacrifice an enchantment. And since Frost Hex is an enchantment that Viscerai controls, he can choose to sacrifice his own Frost Hexes, so it takes away your ability to endgame combo him. And then you're just supposed to block and AB a whole bunch for the rest of the game, I guess. But do you think that's viable?
No idea. It, in theory, makes sense if Viscerai can basically change his deck enough that he has 2 or 3 of these and enough 3 blocks and ways to not die in the meantime. High blue count, high 3 block count, and 2 or 3 of these to kill Frost Hexes. I could see that potentially being a recipe that beats Iyslander.
Yeah, I guess I would think that you would need AB5 at that point, and it's pretty hard to get to that point. So I don't know.
Even with AB3, if you're leaking 2 extra damage or 1 damage from each of the yellow ice veins, 1 damage from each scolding, and 2 extra damage from the red ice veins. That's still only leaking 11 damage. If you're able to block out most of the other stuff, then you should be okay.
Fair enough. Okay, and now what about Briar? So what does Briar do a little bit more competently than Viscera here in this matchup?
So Briar can present more threatening turns on the turns that you don't disrupt her. Like Channel Mount Heroic is a very scary card. And then Briar is also much better at blocking out your attacks, because a lot of the time if she leaks 1 or 2 damage, that embodiment, the averse she gets, means her non-attacks block for 1 extra, which just lets her more efficiently block out your attacks.
Yeah, that's a double-edged sword though, but yeah, we'll get to that.
So the other thing that Briar does better is she doesn't present arcane damage every turn she attacks, only if she attacks with Rosetta Thorn. So against Briar, I am still playing Final Spring Tunic instead of Alluvian Constellus, because she doesn't present arcane damage frequently enough to make Alluvian worthwhile over Tunic, basically.
Yeah, I would agree.
Then sideboarding against Briar, I'm cutting Frost Hexes and Ice Eternals again, because you don't really need to combo Briar. She can't really block you out that well. And then I'm also cutting, this feels bad to say, but I'm cutting the Wounded Bulls in this matchup, because so against Briar, a lot of the time, if you have Aether Ice Vein versus Wounded Bull in your hand, if you have both cards, you'd want to play the Ice Vein over Wounded Bull, because you really want to strip Briar from playing those 4 or 5 card hands when you can. And she also has the embodiments to effectively block out Wounded Bull. If you play Wounded Bull and she blocks it with a 4 block and a 3 block, which is a 3 block and a 2 block, they get +1 each from the embodiment, then that's not a great exchange for you. Suddenly you traded your action point and 2 cards for 2 cards and 1 life, which is fine, but it's not really above rate, right? If they block with 2 cards and you play 2 cards and you get 1 damage and you spend your action point. So Wounded Bull just doesn't look as good into Briar as it does against a lot of other decks. So and then Ice Vein is also very good against Briar, whereas other decks it's just like fine a lot of the time. So you'd rather have Ice Veins than Wounded Bulls. So in a lot of other spots, you can just block with an Ice Vein and attack with a Wounded Bull if you get both. But against Briar, you would almost always choose to block with a Wounded Bull and keep the Ice Vein, which means you should just cut the red 2 blocks. Scar for Scar is still very good though, because if you have Scar and Ice Vein, you can just play the Scar and then play the Ice Vein. So Scar stay in.
Yeah. And then I guess this is also probably another matchup though, where like Sink Below and Brother in Arms shines just because of how many just natural 4s the deck presents.
Yeah. Most of the deck, or a lot of the attacks in the deck, just have 4 power. So you're pretty happy to have both Brother in Arms and Sink Below. Briar plays Snatch, and her snatches a lot of the time are not as hidden the same way Fi's are. So because she has so many ways to give her stuff going in between Embodiment of Lightning, a lot of times she'll play Snatch before the end of her turn, and then you can just play your Sink or your Brother in Arms. One awkward thing that can happen with Sink Below is a lot of Briars aren't Exude Confidence, though, and that can make Sink Below pretty awkward. But I don't think the risk of getting exuded is enough to cut your Sink Belows.
Okay. And then did you talk about what arms you're playing in this matchup?
Yeah, so I do, although Briar doesn't present arcane damage as much as Viscera, you still do want a source of AB1. Your Storm Traders give you AB2 for Rosetta Thorn, but
that's awkward against like if they make Rune Chance and stuff, though.
Yeah. If they make Rune Chance, or even Bramble Spark is a card that I think almost all Briar decks are playing, and sometimes you just want to be able to put 1 resource into blocking the arcane there. So we play Metacarpus Nodes here, and it also gives you some extra reach at the end of the game, which is nice. You're just like I said earlier, you're basically looking for any excuse to play Metacarpus Nodes over the Gauntlets and Bramble Spark, and sometimes wanting to block 1 arcane damage on Rosetta Thorn instead of 2, or want to block Rune Chance is enough to warrant the switch here.
Okay. And then did you want to talk about the timing interaction of those embodiments of Earth that when they go away? I mean, it's a pretty, I think it's fairly known at this point, but it's just another dynamic of the matchup that I think really gives Iyslander an edge, just because normally most decks get that priority at the beginning of the turn. But
Yeah, so at the start of Briar's turn, once she enters her action phase, if she has an embodiment of Earth in play, it's going to put a trigger on the stack to sacrifice it. And you can respond to that trigger by playing a card from your arsenal. And I wouldn't recommend playing just every card from your arsenal at that point, but the main two that I really look to play in this window are Cold Snap, because they won't get a chance to play their arsenal before you Cold Snap them. So you'll get kind of 2 resources, or you freeze their arsenal. So that's like +1 value, kind of, sort of, if they want to play their arsenal, it's +1 value. And then the other card is Channel Lake Frigid, because normally when you play Channel Lake Frigid, you have to wait for them to do something first, and then you Channel Lake Frigid them. But against Briar, you can just run out the Channel Lake Frigid at that point. Okay. The other timing that I play my ice cards from Arsenal a lot is the same timing as against Viscerai, where you're looking for them to have 1 resource floating and an action point, and they want to swing their Rosetta Thorn, and you're like, nope, here's a Frostbite.
Nice try, buddy. Okay. Yeah, but I think as we saw in your World's top 8 run, it's definitely a favorable matchup for Icelanders. So,
yeah, I think of the good decks, I guess I would call them, I think Briar is probably the one that you're most happy to play against.
That makes sense. Okay. Moving on. I think the last 2 decks we're going to cover are Dromai and Dash. Yeah. They're probably the last 2 meta decks, right?
No, Levia.
No, yeah. We'll cover we'll do a second deck tech for all the other amazing heroes in the game, like Bravo, Levia, Azalea. Like, people need to know those, but we'll save that for the second part.
I'm sure that's going to happen. I really believe that'll happen. So let's talk about Dash. Dash has gotten a lot of new toys, and she is very good now and very threatening.
Shake up the meta in a big way, that's for sure.
Yeah. So I think the Dash matchup is a matchup that before I played it, I'm like, this matchup can't be that bad. What does Dash do that these other decks don't? Well, Dash is very good at using however many resources you give her. So if you strip her of a resource because you give her a Frostbite, she doesn't care. She's just going to load one less item at the end of her turn. If you don't disrupt her, she can use her extra resources. So the Dash matchup actually is pretty hard. And you're also not that great at fatiguing. You have a lot of cards that don't block that well. And you have 36 life, and you don't have very good blocking equipment. So, and she can also do the pistol plus induction chamber to really beat your fatigue plan, because you don't have any recurring ways to deal damage. And your weapon, again, doesn't help you fatigue because it does arcane damage. So she can just pitch it to Arcane Barrier.
Yeah, and cards like Blizzard and Hypothermia don't matter as much because she has other additional ways of generating action points. So those cards aren't as disruptive as they would be in other circumstances.
Yeah, I actually think Hypothermia is extremely good against Dash, because basically...
Yeah, I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not as good as it might otherwise be, I guess.
Yeah, I think this is the matchup where it's at its best. But
wow,
sometimes she plays High Octane, and you look at your Hypothermia and Arsenal, and you're like, oh no. And
what about Achilles Accelerator, though? Doesn't that let them just get them an action point, though, at instant speed?
Yeah, so Achilles Accelerator, if they sacrifice it, they're giving up 1 Arcane Barrier, which is pretty good. Or, like, you're pretty happy if that happens early in the game. And then it just lets them do one more thing, basically, because their next thing still won't be able to gain go again because of the Hypothermia. So the way I'm looking to use my Hypothermias in this matchup is I'm looking for my opponent to have an Arsenal. And then on my turn, I want to basically play like a Frost Hex or an Insidious Chill and just leave them with a 5-card hand and then Arsenal the Hypothermia. And then they have a 5-card hand, and I'm going to play the Hypothermia when they do their first thing. And then they're just like waste 2 or 3 cards is kind of the goal.
Okay. What happens if your opponent knows you have a Hypothermia in Arsenal? How would you play that spot?
Similarly, I would look to just like block with a couple cards and then spend my turn setting up a Frost Hex or an Insidious Chill. And then they're going to have a 5-card hand at some point, or a 4-card hand even, and it's fine to just Hypothermia that. You just like really want to make sure you're getting like, you're burning a card or 2 if you can. And then if they aren't ever keeping those big hands, eventually you could just play a permanent and force them to, basically.
Okay, good to know.
For next time it comes up, you know?
Yeah, in case that ever pops up for anybody else's games, you know?
Mm-hmm. So, cards I'm looking to cut here. I don't like Sink Below because it's a lot of the time they are just spending their turn attacking with pistol or doing random stuff, and you're not guaranteed to line up a 0 for 4 with it, basically. And the turns where you like strip their hand and draw Sink Below is pretty game losing. And Dash also does not have very many on hits. She has like Combustible Courier, I think, is the only one that actually matters, where it gives your next thing +3.
Yeah, and then there's the one that gives Dominate, but yeah.
Yeah, the one that gives Dominate doesn't really matter because what's she going to dominate? A 5-power boost attack? Throttle?
Wow.
Oh no. So the one that gives Dominate doesn't really matter.
Okay.
So I'm cutting my Sink Belows. I'm also cutting Brain Freeze. There just aren't that many targets in her deck that you want to strip with Brain Freeze. She does have a non-zero number of hits, but sometimes you'll play it and it'll miss. And again, your blocking is not that important in the matchup. I guess I am still keeping the Brother in Arms because of Combustible Courier and needing to use my Tunic counters in ways, but
and it's one of the few matchups where like it can also just block for 2 and it's fine against pistol and stuff.
Yeah, though you're never really happy to block a pistol for 2. It comes up sometimes.
But sometimes you got to block pistol.
Yeah. For the last cut, I think... What am I cutting as the last cut against Dash? It might just be like Frosting or something. No, we're cutting energy potions.
Yeah,
I didn't say energy.
Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah,
but that
card does not seem great. Any of the reds you're cutting outside from Sink Below?
No,
everything else staying in?
I think all the attacks are good enough because, like, well, all of our cards do block for 3. You're still getting like +1 in a card most of the time when you play like a Scar for a Scar, or if you play like a Finals Fighting Spirit or Wounded Boy, you're going +2 off of your 2 cards for 2 cards, and you really need ways to spend your action points. Otherwise, you're just like kind of spewing value if you're not using your action points.
Yeah.
I think it's just Frostings as the last cut, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, Frosting sucks. Get it out of here. So what headpiece are you playing in this matchup then? Because you kept saying, well, your Dash is just good at playing however many cards or resources you give her. So that would probably lead me to believe that Coronet Peak is just not impactful at all in this match.
So this kind of is different from other matches where I do still really like Coronet Peak against Dash. And there's a couple of reasons. First is, like I said earlier, she doesn't really have very many on hits. So Crown of Providence, that 2 block breakpoint. Well, I guess you can also block 2 with Coronet Peak, but you don't really want to throw away your Coronet Peak usually too early.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But she doesn't really have breakpoints, so you don't care that much about getting stuck with cards and needing to block with Crown of Providence. Though, yeah, so I don't really value it that highly. And then the other difference is Channel Lake Frigid is super good in this matchup because when she wants to attack with her gun, she has to pay an extra to load things, pay an extra to give it go again with the ejection chamber, and then pay an extra to actually attack with it. So everything just gets taxed because of Channel Lake Frigid. And because of that, a lot of the time you want Coronet Peak so that you can just pitch an ice card to Coronet Peak the turn after you play Channel. So you can keep the channel around without needing to have like something to do with your resources. So because of that, I think Coronet Peak is quite good, though I'm not really looking to activate it on random turns. It's just mostly to keep Channel Lake Frigid around.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense now that you talk about it like that. And then I imagine this is an Ironhide Gauntlet matchup though.
Yeah. I think Ironhide Gauntlet is just, again, you need a ways to use your extra resources sometimes. So it's nice to have it. It's not great. I think it's slightly better than Iron Raw Gauntlet. But again, I think this is a spot where like if you didn't have Ironhide Gauntlet and you just brought Iron Raw Gauntlet, I don't think you'd be too unhappy.
That's fair. And so like let's talk about some of these new toys that Dash got that can really change the impact of this matchup. And first and foremost, so how do you think we're going to beat the Gundam, the Nitroid Mechanoid? This just seems like it's going to be a nightmare for Iyslander to deal with, right? Just like this insane value of this giant robot. Iyslander's ice is very good against robots, right?
So if Dash does make the Mechanoid, then that means she does not have Arcane Barrier, because all the Arcane Barrier goes into the Gundam.
Robots can't deal with magic. I forgot about that. It's my bad.
So I have not played against the Mechanoid yet, and she does start with Arcane Barrier 3 because the hat and the boots both have AB, and the hat has AB too. But if she builds the Mechanoid, then she has no Arcane Barrier, so she has to kill you pretty quickly from that point.
That's fair. Okay, we'll talk about the real one. How about Pulse Wave Harpoon? How impactful do you think this card's going to be?
So Pulse Wave Harpoon is a very good card. It's one of the probably strongest cards in the set, in my opinion, because like just being able to strip specific cards from your opponent is very valuable. I think it can be pretty hard for Dash to boost 3 times against Iyslander. And if she boosts 2 times, then a lot of the time your hand's going to be 2 blues and a Wounded Bull. And she boosts 2 times with that. And she doesn't get to see all 3 of your cards. She just gets to see 2. So you can hide the Wounded Bull and make sure it's safe. Or the Finals Fighting Spirit or whatever you were wanting to play that turn.
Okay.
But if she boosts 3 times and plays it and forces your Wounded Bull to block, I don't know if there's a lot we can do to play around that. And it kind of sucks when it happens, but I don't think it'll come up that often.
Yeah, boosting 4 times is a lot to be asked for in a turn most of the time, and it's especially hard to do through like Frostbites or Channel Light Fridges or Coronet Peaks and things like that. So I don't know just how super impactful the card will be, but I guess time will tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that card is very good, but I think it shines mostly against like the aggressive decks that are looking to keep very specific 4-card hands. Or just keep 4-card hands in general.
Okay. Any final thoughts about Dash?
The last thing, I've kind of talked about this, how Dash can use however many resources you give her pretty efficiently. So a lot of the time, you'll want to just save your ice card in Arsenal and wait to see what she does. And if she loads her gun and goes to 0 resources loading, that's when you want to give her a Frostbite so she can't use her action point to shoot the gun.
Yeah. The more I think about it, though, the way Michael Hamilton looks at it is the ice cards aren't just ice cards in the arsenal. They're trap cards. You can't just be throwing out your trap cards willy-nilly. You got to wait for them to be activated, and then you have to flip them over and you say, you've activated my ice trap card, right?
And then you give them a Frostbite, and then that Frostbite...
And then you banish them to the Shadow Realm. Is that what you do?
No, but that is how I time them.
That's fair.
You only want to give them a Frostbite when the Frostbite matters, because... outside of Polar Blast and Cold Snap, your cards into Waning Moon are pretty inefficient from Arsenal. So you don't want to just be like flipping them up all willy-nilly and not getting value out of the Frostbite. And even with Cold Snap and Polar Blast, you still want to maximize the value you're getting out of the Frostbite. Just because they're efficient anyway doesn't mean you want to just like waste them.
Okay. I believe it.
All right. And last is Dromai. Is that right?
Yeah, but we already covered this, right? Because we just covered it on the last episode of Manor University of Dromai versus Iyslander. So it was a really good, insightful discussion, a lot of good gameplay. We really broke it down and talked about the do's and don'ts in the matchup. So do you think we really need to cover this?
Well, that's not available to the general public, right?
Oh, that's right. That's right. Sorry, I forgot about that. So I guess they just have to go to www.patreon.com/manorpodcast in order to see that content. But we'll talk about it here too.
So real quick against Dromai, this matchup you play Stormstrider's Metacarpus Node Tunic, and then the hats between Crown of Providence and Coronet Peak, I think it's very close. Coronet Peak has the same interaction against Dash where you can keep Channel Lake around with it, which matters less against Dromai, but Crown of Providence also isn't that great. Could be convinced on either hat. I've been running Crown of Providence recently, but I think there are arguments for Coronet Peak. This matchup, though, it kind of goes against everything I said about saving Stormstriders and saving Metacarpus nodes till you're killing them, because I guess I should talk about kind of the dynamic of the matchup where Dromai plays her dragons, and when Dromai declares them as an attacker, you can kill the dragon basically before the effect, the on attack trigger goes on the stack. So she's gonna play.
Yeah, you stop their attacking attack from attacking before the attacking attack is an attack.
Yeah, and I talked about this on an episode not that long ago, the Worlds Recap episode, but basically that's kind of how you want to do it. They're going to lose their action point, and then you're good. They don't have an action point anymore. So you want to basically line up your stuff to disrupt all the dragons, and early game, you're just trying to push as much damage as you can before she gets a big amount of dragons. Then late game, you're kind of pivoting to stopping her from killing you, and also trying to find a way to kill her, which sometimes is Frost X combo, sometimes it's just pushing damage through efficient attacks and Waning Moon. But yeah, that's kind of how the matchup plays. I guess for sideboarding, I cut Sink Below. It's pretty bad because
there's not a lot of good spots for Sink Below. I guess Dust Up is like the big thing, but like that's pretty niche.
Yeah.
But you were saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You're okay. So Sink Below comes out, Energy Potion comes out. This is the one matchup that I'm considering cutting Amulet Device specifically because it can be really awkward into Kyloria. And a lot of the time.
Oh, they can steal your items, huh?
Yeah, they steal your amulet device, which a lot of the time them taking your amulet device hurts more than them just drawing a card because maybe they couldn't use the card very effectively, or they're under a channel like Frigid or something like that, or they're hypothermiaed, so their dragon doesn't actually have go again. So it can be really rough to have to block the Kyloria to protect your amulet device in spots that you wouldn't normally want to. And then almost all of your cards are pretty good in this matchup because all your reds are poppers or Enlightened Strike or Scar for Scar, which are Scar for Scar is great for killing a dragon and having go again. And Enlightened Strike, you can also choose the go again mode, which is good. And also just attacking Dromai, it can put her in spots that make it hard for her to keep a hand that does something and also block out your attacks. So like attacking Dromai is quite good. I am cutting Heart of Final in this matchup because a lot of the time the one life doesn't matter, I want to say, because the games you're losing are frequently because she has a board that got out of control and you weren't able to stop it for that turn.
Yeah, I could especially see that being the case because these matches aren't going super long, right? Like you're not going very deep into second cycle, right?
Yeah, usually, I think you usually will get to the start of second cycle, but the game usually ends pretty quickly after that because you have a lot less disruption for her dragons. You're through all your poppers. You either need to be killing her pretty early in second cycle or you're going to have trouble stopping the dragon onslaught.
Yeah. What would you say is the most impactful dragon in the matchup?
So
which dragon are you most unhappy to see?
There's two dragons. I think both Thamai and Chromai are very important. Chromai, if they start their turn by attacking with Chromai, even if you kill it, they'll still get an action point because they'll either get an extra action point for attacking with it or they get an extra action point when it leaves the battlefield. And that extra action point can allow them to do pretty strong things. Like they can play around hypothermia with it. And it's also just means if you try to strip their action point by killing a dragon at any point, they'll still have one left over. So
right.
Chromai is very good and very annoying. And the fact that it costs 0 comes up a lot because they can just leave their turn with Chromai and they have 6 dragons in play. And you're like, oh no, I'm going to take so much damage this turn. And then the other annoying one is Thamai. Thamai costs 2 resources, so it can be a lot more awkward for them to play it, especially if you're attacking them the turn before they have it. But Thamai is just text of you can't play cards on their turn. It is very good against everything you're trying to do. You are trying to play a card to stop them from attacking you with all their dragons. And because of that, Thamai is very good against you. And they're still vulnerable to poppers. So if they play Thamai and then they attack with any dragon, you can still pop it. But it's still
that shouldn't happen very often. Like good Dromai players, I guess, just being a little blunt, shouldn't really be attacking with the Thamais very much in the matchup.
But if they play a Thamai and attack with an Ashwing, even if you can't play your ice card from Arsenal, you can still pop the Ashwing and they'll lose their action point. So then you don't have to worry about the rest of the turn. And then you can play your Scar for a Scar or E-Strike or Blue Brother in Arms to kill the Thamai on your turn.
Wait, what? Could you repeat that?
So if you pop the Ashwing with your popper, their turn's going to end because they have no action point.
And while there's a Thamai on the battlefield?
Yeah, if you pop it with a popper.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood. I thought you were saying like kill it with kill the Ashwing from like an Arsenal card. I was like, you can't do that though with Thamai. That's the whole point of the card.
Yeah. So the poppers are still very good. And
okay.
So Chromai also can kind of be vulnerable to a popper where if you pop the Chromai, they'll have 1 action point, and then you can play a blue from Arsenal to kill the next attacking dragon. But basically these 2 dragons are the most annoying, and I will frequently when I'm playing the game, I will be counting them and I will be paying a lot of attention to when they pitch one of these 2 dragons. So I know I need to end the game before that gets back, or if they have a board, I'm in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. So earlier we talked about how single blue is not very impactful, but why don't you talk to me about like the secret mode of why Brother in Arms is like really good in this matchup?
So yeah, Brother in Arms, the block for 4 doesn't matter that much. Occasionally you can use Tunic and use it to block like a Kyloria or a Dust Up, but they don't have that many on hits and they don't have that many things that really attack for 4. But it kills Thamai, it kills Chromai. You need to kill those 2 dragons. You can attack a dragon. So it's good.
Get them.
Yeah.
You need Red Brother in Arms now too. That way it just does everything. It slices and dices and yeah.
Uh-huh.
But I guess I shouldn't give away your tech like that. I'm sorry. My bad.
And then I guess the last thing I want to say about the matchup is a lot of the time you'll end your opponent's turn because you kill their dragon, they attack with an Ashwing, you frosting it. They're going to have 1 or 2 cards left over in hand a lot of the time. And if they have a card in hand in an arsenal, or even 2 cards in hand in an arsenal, then don't Waning Wind them. Don't do it. They're just going to pitch their card, Arcane Barrier all your stuff, maybe even get an extra Ash, and you're going to spend a whole extra card to Waning Wind them and deal 1 damage or 0 damage, or sometimes even 2 damage, and they'll get an Ash out of the deal, which feels good, but it feels okay. But like if you're spending a whole extra card to do it, it's not great. So just be very selective about when you actually Waning Wind them here.
Okay. Did you talk about what gloves you're playing in this matchup?
Yeah, so I think I did, but I play Metacarpus nodes here because they do have a little bit of arcane damage with Asvali, and sometimes they play Burn Them All. I think they should be siding out their Burn Them Alls against you, but you'll see Burn Them All sometimes. And when you have Metacarpus nodes against them, it also helps make it easier to reach breakpoints to kill specific dragons. Let's say they play a Kyloria and attack with it, and you have a blue frosting in arsenal. You can use Metacarpus nodes now to kill the Kyloria with the frosting and basically shut down their turn. And this is the one matchup where I think things change, where before I said never use Stormfighters, never use nodes unless it's lethal. Against Dromai, I will use either of these cards to stop big turns and also stop the legendary dragons like Dominia and Tumultai.
Yeah. Those cards are nightmares, that's for sure. Okay. Yeah, but you would definitely say Dromai's Iyslander is like worse matchup, like overall though, in like meta decks, right?
I think so. I could see a reasonable argument for Dash, but I think Dromai is harder, especially like a Dromai bot that has a lot of reps into the matchup and is very experienced and prepared and knows how to maximize like Chromize and Themize against you. It's very challenging.
Okay. Definitely makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate you talking and doing this deck tech about Iyslander. I know you were hesitant to just kind of like put out like a sideboarding guide, just because as we've now discussed for an hour and 20 minutes, there's a lot of nuance to a lot of these decisions and specific reasons that can change depending on how lists are adapting in this new meta that's coming up with Dynasty coming out, or just contextual based on like what's happening on specific builds of the deck as well. So thank you very much for doing this and just sharing all of your wonderful icy insights with all of us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It seems like it was asked for a lot, and I kind of was very hesitant, especially with like specific sideboard things, because even in this discussion, a lot of my sideboard things were like, I think you do this, but you could do this instead. And a lot of that is going to change, and my opinions are going to change on some of those things over time. But that's how I currently think everything, or what you should do now in all the spots. So
that's fair. I mean, you're the world champion, so doesn't that mean all of your opinions are just objectively correct now? I thought that's how it works.
I am human.
Oh, dang.
Unlucky.
What are you going to do? Okay. Any final thoughts to wrap things up, Michael?
Also, thank you for doing this and kind of pushing me to do this a little bit, because I was definitely hesitant, and the people wanted it, I think. So let us know in the comments if this is what you wanted.
And I'm nothing but a man of the people, that's for sure, at the end of the day. So once again, then, I also have to thank all the patrons. So patrons obviously really requested this. So thank you for everybody who's joined our community. The support continues to be amazing. Our community is growing, which seems just like more and more people every day. Discord's really blowing up. Lots of good conversations happening there. If you want to learn how to play Go, I just posted like 1 million Go videos today. So we're growing the Go community as well at the same time here. And yeah, just awesome little community we're building here, huh, Michael?
Yeah. I'm not as hands-on as you are, but I think I read everything that gets posted there. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but I don't always have time to respond. You got more important
things to do. You know, you're just busy polishing all your trophies and you know, just framing exactly where you want to put your giant checks in your house. It's a lot to manage, I know. So I get it.
All right.
Well, I guess on that note, thank you for watching, everybody. The next time you're playing Flesh and Blood, always remember, mind your manners. Thanks for listening.